Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman, and today we've got one of our ramble style videos. So Amazon just came out with an adaptation of a very popular game series called Yakuza. Ever since HBO did The Last of Us, video game adaptations have been all the rage. Now I could preface this with a little backstory regarding my love of the Yakuza franchise, but it's nothing really unique. I got into it by playing Yakuza 0 from watching Donkey's video, and it was a wrap after that. I've played every title besides the 2 Ichiban ones, and I've loved them all. I think that this is probably one of my top 5 video game series, but that's all irrelevant to the point of this video. I only say it to establish that I know the series fairly well, and that sort of informs all of my opinions regarding the adaptation. Oh, I also think it's worth mentioning that this is not the first Yakuza adaptation there's been. One even came out a year or two after the first game, and it was directed by acclaimed Japanese director Takashi Miike. This guy did a film I really enjoy called Ichi the Killer, which it's a pretty nutty movie, but it's very enjoyable. It stars Tadanobu Asano, and he's a great actor. Anyway, Takashi Miike's Yakuza adaptation was actually pretty solid, although it's ultimately inferior to the stage play that would come out some years later. Personally, I enjoy the movie. I've only seen it once back when it was on YouTube, and I don't think it's still available, but you can pretty much watch the whole thing through clips. Like I said, for when it came out, it's a pretty solid movie and video game adaptation. Again, it came out in like 2007. That's the era where there was pretty much every video game adaptation was bad. Although, let it be known, I liked Timothy Olyphant's portrayal of Hitman. Or maybe I just liked that movie for Olga Kurylenko. What I'm trying to say is, I really wanted to like this Yakuza adaptation. Like I said, I enjoyed the first one except for its ending. Sure, it's dated and everybody's going to have little complaints here and there about portrayals and that, but it overall kind of still holds up as a decent video game adaptation. This new one is something else. Like most of the cast, they actually do a pretty good job. Same with even the English dub, which is still, it's an English dub. What can you expect? It's not worse than a lot of the other ones I've heard. But the actual acting from most of the actors is pretty solid. There's a couple, outliers where they're pretty bad, but almost all of the main cast is pretty solid. The writers, on the other hand, betrayed the cast at almost every single turn. Maybe it wasn't just the writers, maybe the producers or someone behind the scenes of this really is who's to blame, but that's a whole thing. One thing I enjoyed was seeing Kamurocho in live action, and a lot of the montages were really good. I mean, they're set to some interesting music choices, that's for sure, but I like Mr. Blue Sky. It's like a song I've been hearing in TV shows since the beginning of time. But yeah, the camera work and those montages, I didn't mind that. I thought those were pretty cool, especially after seeing the rest of the show. The montage in episode 2 is one of the high points, for sure. The portrayal of the Mad Dog of Shimano being another. And I liked how the dub even got Matthew Mercer to come back and voice him. Too bad they couldn't get Mark Hamill, though. Of course, he only had about 12 minutes of screen time, so there's that. And by portrayal, I mean the actor's portrayal, not the writings. That's kind of an example of what I mean, though. They just made some truly baffling decisions, and it ends up this bizarre-ass end product. And not bizarre in the good way, like the games are. It's bizarre in like the bad way, and how the hell did this come to be? Several of these changes and choices of things to change severely watered down a lot of the impact and the effectiveness of several of the characters and the actions that they commit. My big problem was that it was just too serious. And maybe it's a nitpick, but I didn't really see anything that felt like a sub-story, The sub-stories are in many ways some of the best part of the games. And while not everybody may agree with that, I think everybody would agree that they are an essential and integral part of the Yakuza experience. I mean, yes, they're mostly just reading dialogue and doing one or two things, or maybe taking a quiz or picking the right dialogue option, but I've always found them to be hilariously goofy as hell, lovably goofy. And yeah, again, some of them are extremely predictable or are like Hallmark movies or after-school specials, but it's sort of what makes them work. They almost feel like that Darman guy before he became self-aware. Almost the same kind of comedy. Sometimes, obviously. Some of the sub-stories are just straight up great, like the one where you have to help Steven Spielberg and Michael Jackson. But you get what I mean. Most of them are funny, and others are completely out in left field style wacky, like teaching a dominatrix how to be a better dominatrix. Those tend to be my favorites, and obviously this show is better in Japanese, just like the games. But they did bring some notable English voice acting heavies for some of these roles, like I believe Nishiki is voiced by Ichigo, and then Matt Mercer does Majima. There's some other ones too that are definitely noticeable if you've watched dubbed anime in the past 10 years. And the dub isn't terrible. I mean, English dubs and live action things are always questionable at best, but I couldn't really watch this whole thing in a dub. I had to watch it in Japanese because that's how all the games were up until I think 7. That's of course not including the hilarious localization of the first Yakuza game, which I recommend everybody either play or watch a video of, because that is, it's just pure cinema. And yeah, I'm getting a little off topic here, but the biggest problem I think people are going to have with this show is the changes to the characters and just the overall source material, but mostly to the characters. I also think it tries to do way too much with only 6 45-minute episodes. I mean, it's trying to cover Kiryu and Nishiki joining the Yakuza, and then, you know, the stuff that happened before Kiryu went to prison, and then the stuff that happened after. Basically a lot of the Kiwami stuff. Then there's the added stuff like the creation of Yumi's sister that I believe was just a fabrication in the first game. It's also trying to cover the various reasons that Kiryu and Nishiki might have this tense relationship in the present, as well as their reasoning for joining the Yakuza, but this is all done, you know, jumping back and forth from 1995 to 2005. So it's doing this balancing act while also incorporating elements of Zero and, you know, completely changing Majima's first interaction with Kiryu. It ends up feeling like there's all these moments that they knew they wanted to include in the show, but they didn't really know how to do it in their new vision for what the story in the show was going to be. So they just kind of dropped them in there. I mean, again, they're fitting all this stuff in, and then they added this killer subplot who's going around killing Yakuza, and they sort of mixed that in with the heist of the 10 billion yen. There's just so many things that people are going to take issue with, and the showrunners should have known that. But they just made so many insane, questionable decisions, and they really did mischaracterize almost all of the main characters. And again, the cast does what it can to elevate this and alleviate these concerns, but the writing is there to undo it, like I said, at every turn. And basically this results in there occasionally being glimpses of a good adaptation just buried deep beneath a lot of the bullshit. It's usually found in little character interactions or sort of on-the-nose direct references to the games, like how Kiryu repeats back the Florist of Sai after he's first told about the guy. Another good example would be when fan favorite Majima and his buddy, the brick shithouse of Kansai, are accosting that shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper pulls a gun on them, and then he pulls out a second gun, like, I got a gun for each of you. That just felt like something that would happen in one of the Yakuza games. But outside of these few instances, there's not a whole lot of humor in the show. And that might be one of its bigger problems. I feel like it takes itself way too seriously, and sure, you could argue that the main story of the games is probably the most serious part about them, but the stories are never without their humor, especially with characters like Akiyama here. Like, the stories he's involved with are very serious, but he himself is very hilarious within them. And as for convoluted, I mean, some of these stories get really fucking convoluted. I mean, Rubber Bullets, Yakuza 5, even the most well-written entries like Yakuza 0 are pretty fucking, well, complicated. I think a good way of describing the main stories of the Yakuza games would be to say that they are as serious as they are convoluted, and the humor lies in the sub-stories or individual characters like Majima, or like Akiyama and Tanimura from Yakuza 4, or Shinada from Yakuza 5. But the main bulk of the humor from the Yakuza games comes from the overall world and interacting with it through short stories and mini-games, and the jobs that you can have in the various games, like Ramen Peddler, Hostess Club Manager, etc. There's a lot of humor to be found in the individual job storylines, especially the taxi driver one in Yakuza 5, or the bear hunting one in Yakuza 5. Probably not the time to say it, but I actually really do enjoy Yakuza 5. It's right up there with 0, but I enjoy all the games. They're all great. Those two are just my favorite. Now, going back to the Amazon series, they turned some characters who were more serious in the games into sort of comic relief idiots, like the Florist of Sai. Or maybe I just felt that way because the actor looked like Bobby Lee to me. But other than these few instances, I truly believe that the creators of the show didn't really understand the Yakuza games, or maybe only played part of the first one. I mean, after watching all 6 episodes, that's kind of honestly what I believe. That they had one of their interns play maybe some of Kiwami and watch a YouTuber play most of Zero and sort of get the gist of the series and some of the characters that they wanted to have in the show, and they just sort of use that as the basis to write their story for this adaptation, again, if you can call it that. It really feels like it was made by someone who had the game explained to him, or watched cutscenes on YouTube from the game. And the reason I think this is actually also gonna segue nicely into one of my main criticisms of the show, and I don't know if I've said it yet, but I just feel like there wasn't enough fights. You know, that might sound like a meathead criticism, one that I myself am even shocked that I'm making, but given the source material, it kind of makes sense. There's a whole episode, at least one whole episode, where there was no fight, which to me is, I don't know, not enough fights. And really, there wasn't enough interesting story developments either to keep me enthralled, since there was a lack of fights. I mean, the game is an over-the-top soap opera adventure fighting game at its core. You know, it's a life simulator, of course. While the games have all these other avenues of entertainment, fighting is the core focus and the main thing you do in them. And in the show, it's just treated as a reference to the games, basically. And don't even get me started on the fight between Nishiki and Kiryu in the Millennium Tower in the games versus the show, because it's literally night and day. And look, I'm not even hating on them if that's all the research they did, because you'd think that even with that amount of research, you know, watching someone play Zero, watching someone play Kiwami and taking notes, you'd think that a team of writers would be able to adapt that in a fairly true to its source material while also making necessary changes sort of way. But I have this sneaking suspicion that they never really wanted to do that. They wanted to tell their own story while keeping elements of the games to keep it recognizable for fans of the franchise. Like, sure, it adapts part of the first game and ideas from Zero, I guess, or character names from Zero, like Sagawa and Shibusaya, for no reason, really. Plot important events are completely changed. Characters who are killed in one way in the games are killed a completely different way in the show. Things that ruin the mystery of other characters like Majima are shown and kind of, well, for lack of a better term, ruined, like the removal of his eye to the a cover of the Gary Jules version of Mad World. Never mind that the Tears for Fears version would probably be better fitting given the time period it's set in. Nishiki's character might as well be a different guy. Like, yeah, the main points are there. He's Kiryu's childhood buddy, and he grows to resent him and become jealous of him. I suppose those are all the same, but the reasoning is completely different. And just based on the ending, I'm assuming that a few key points were missed by the writing staff, because there's just too much goddamn Nishiki in this, and I've never been a big fan of him, but they completely mischaracterized him and made him into this emo, sad guy he's basically a full anime character, a full, like, dark, evil anime character, like Darkstar from fucking the last A Song of Ice and Fire book, the one where they're in Dorne for most of the fucking thing. The guy who says, "I am of the night." That's basically what Nishiki was in this show. They took a character who, in the games, isn't completely incompetent or pathetic. He's really neither of those two things. He actually has some things he's better at than Kiryu, like with women. Nishiki is a ladies' man, and that's nowhere to be found at all in the series. His whole thing, what began to eat away at him, was the constant comparisons to someone as capable and badass as Kiryu. You know, he's always coming up unfavorably when compared against a guy like that. He probably also had resentment that he couldn't truly be mad at Kiryu for this because it's not his fault. I mean, the guy even went to prison for him. And look, I know it can be tiresome or even hack to complain about changes in regards to an adaptation of something on TV. But I mean, these changes, man, they just water down the characters and the source material of the Yakuza series in such a insane way. And yes, all adaptations are going to change things. I understand that. I'm always defending that, actually. But the changes have to be meaningful, and they have to serve the purpose of actually adapting it onto screen well. I'm not even saying that they have to elevate it or even uplift the source material. No, they don't have to do any of that. They could just pay it some sort of form of respect. The changes should be in service to a greater outcome, a greater finished product. One that still honors what it's adapting, but also can stand alone on its own 2 feet as a solid, piece of entertainment. And this really, it does neither. But let's get to the simultaneously the best and worst part of this series, this adaptation, is its characters. And I'll try and go over each one of the ones and how they were changed and how those changes sort of affected everything. So let's start with Kiryu, since he's the main character. Now, I know I've already talked a little bit about the portrayal of the legendary character, and I believe the actor does a pretty decent job. He's got a good scowl for the role, or at least as good of one as you could hope for. He's got to play Kiryu both before and after a 10-year prison stint, and the differences are noticeable. I like to view it as a subtle reference they made to Kiryu never aging, because they used the same actor for before and after. He reminds me of Kiryu in Zero before he gets locked up, and then, stoic as hell after he gets out. Basically exactly like how Kiryu from the first game acts. And he's like that for most of the period in the show, so it was pretty, fitting. It's a little bit of a looser portrayal of the 1995 timeline, but the actor does well, and it isn't completely ruined by the writing, like many things are. Again, I like his perpetual scowl, but I feel like he wasn't imposing enough like Kiryu is in the games. I feel like maybe he wasn't tall enough, which is a nitpick. His fights were decent. There was lots of heat actions, lots of him standing around smoking cigarettes and staring off into the distance, the usual Kiryu behavior. I both like and don't like how him and Majima met. Like, it was completely different than it is in the games, and it just kind of came out of nowhere. And his reasoning for joining the Yakuza is a bit iffy to me. He wants to be like this mysterious dragon of Dojima, so he plans some robbery with a bunch of his friends, and they steal from the Yakuza and beg to be let in. It turns out, he's perfect for it, and he becomes their star fighter. Nishiki, on the other hand, is not so lucky. So let's talk about him next, because besides Kiryu, he probably had the most screen time. So Nishiki was a lot more evil and sinister in the show than he was in either version of 1 or Kiwami. I mean, he lost just about everything that made him a decent, somewhat likable character. He's got a secret masked murder gang that he's a part of. I mean, he's literally a full teenage anime villain. Look at this portrayal of him. Pretty much everything interesting about his character was abandoned. So they tried to make Nishiki more sympathetic, but also more hateable by having this instance where Kiryu is in the ring fighting a guy for the prize money to help Nishiki's ailing sister get a life-saving operation, to pay for it. But the Dojima family patriarch tells Nishiki to get Kiryu to lose the fight because he knows they're buddies, and that there's a donor for his sister, that he'll take care of all of it as long as Kiryu just tanks the fight. Kiryu obviously doesn't lose the fight. I think it ends in a draw or something like that, but ultimately Dojima was never going to get Nishiki a donor anyway. I mean, honestly, there's a little bit too much of Nishiki in his nonsense in this show, and it's not even adapted in an interesting enough way, really, that they just keep adding stuff to make the audience either feel bad for him or just hate him even more. I mean, they literally made it Kiryu's fault that his sister died. I mean, I guess it's also partially Dojima's fault, which sort of makes his murder of Dojima even more personal in the show than it was in the games, although in the game it was still pretty personal. But they try to make it like partly Kiryu's fault, where in the game it's completely different. I mean, Kiryu takes the blame for Dojima's murder so that Nishiki can spend time with his dying sister before she passes away, and the reason Dojima is killed in the game is because he tried to rape Yumi. Whereas, like I said, in the show, he just kills Dojima because there was never any donor for his sister, and because, Dojima had always treated Nishiki like shit, only in the show. They also randomly have Nishiki try to rape Yumi instead of it being Dojima, so, again, there's a lot of weird changes in this story. I mean, at the end, when Nishiki's dead, are we really supposed to feel bad for this fucking guy? It's definitely framed as such. I mean, by the time you find out that he's the one behind the mass killings, which is, of course, a show original plotline, he's done so much horribly bad shit while having, literally negative charisma and likability that there's no way that you're surprised that it's him who is behind the murders, and there's absolutely no way you feel any ounce of sympathy for him. I mean, in the final fight, he's dressed quite literally like the fucking Emperor from Star Wars. He's wearing a black robe from the movie Scream, and they completely tossed out the koi fish swimming upriver to become a dragon, that he's been training to become a better fighter to surpass Kiryu. That's something that's not even considered, and it wouldn't really be believable for this portrayal of Nishiki either. Presumably, the writers felt that was lame, and they'd rather do a murder cult subplot. It's tough to say. But I absolutely hated that final fight between Nishiki and Kiryu. I mean, mostly just because Kiryu had any respect for him in the end, whereas in the games, at least it makes sense. I just don't think that the show has a good portrayal of the character of Nishiki, but it's not the actor's fault. In the games, he's this less than impressive Yakuza, at least less impressive than Kiryu, but he still had his skills and uses. He was good with the women and stuff like that. And we see through the flashbacks in Yakuza Kiwami that after Kiryu got locked up, that he had it pretty rough, especially on his own, while always being compared to Kiryu. Now this is, I guess, a bit similar to what they do in the show, but instead of becoming like a ruthless mob boss character because of all these hardships he's enduring without his buddy, he becomes this resentful little kind of emo weakling. He's absolutely not intimidating. He was a pathetic wimp right from the start. I mean, look how he joins the Yakuza, and in the show he dies a pathetic wimp. Compare this to Nishiki and Zero, who is fully loyal to Kiryu and has his back in any situation, would probably die for his best friend. Clearly showing that when they first joined up, they had a lot of respect for each other, there was no resentment, and they were both pretty competent. Obviously, it skewed towards Kiryu being the better fighter of the two, but Nishiki wasn't just a useless weakling. And compare that to the show, where he's literally depicted as a straight-up burden on Kiryu, especially in the flashbacks. That vibe never really came across to me in the games. And again, I know I've already said it, but I'm not even the biggest fan of this character in the games, but at least his final action was one of redemption. He chooses to take out Jingu and get blown up, which results in the 10 billion yen flying everywhere from Millennium Tower, which also allows Akiyama to restart his life, because that was the point in time where he was homeless. Getting a little bit off track there, but compare that to in the show, where his final act is to just try and kill Kiryu again, resulting in him basically stabbing himself. In the end, I just felt like, what was the point of this character? But let's move on to Kiryu's father figure and mentor Kazama, since he had a pretty sizable meaty role in the adaptation. So this character has been changed a lot too. He's sort of a lot more stereotypical mentor role in the show, whereas in the games he's a bit more complex. So he's this character who owns an orphanage full of the kids of the people he killed as a Yakuza killer, a hitman. In the games, he's still in the Yakuza in the 80s when Kiryu joins. In fact, Kazama never leaves. He dies in the Yakuza. He's the whole reason Kiryu and Nishiki want to join, because they idolized him and they wanted to be like him. It's sort of, it is the whole reason they joined. In the show, however, they made him basically the stereotypical retired mobster gangster character, and Kiryu and Nishiki also don't know that he's former Yakuza in the show, so they seemingly want to join for little to no reason. But not so fast. Kiryu was actually inspired by a mysterious Yakuza he heard of called the Dragon of Dojima, the Tojo clan's best fighter, and he has this Naruto-style goal of wanting to be the next one. I shit you not, that's basically Kiryu's motivation at the beginning of the show. I don't really have to explain how that's kinda hack or far worse than the original setup, especially when they reveal at the very end of this series that Kazama was in fact this mysterious Dragon of Dojima that inspired Kiryu. But seriously, what a roundabout way of depicting that Kiryu was inspired by Kazama, something that's basically described within the first hour or so of Yakuza 0. If they wanted a good twist, they could have made him realize that Kazama was who killed his parents and made him an orphanage and have him deal with that, which would actually be interesting since Kiryu and Kazama never had any fallout from the revelation that Kazama offed Kiryu's parents, mainly because immediately after telling Kiryu this, Kazama just dies, leaving Kiryu with a complicated memory of his mentor. In the show, however, they kept Kazama alive at the end of the series, but they still didn't do that. They didn't even have any reveal or anything like that. The only reveal was that he was the previous Dragon of Dojima. I also didn't like at the beginning, Kazama just basically rejoins the Tojo clan anyway and becomes a Yakuza again. Like, what was the point of him leaving? Is that supposed to be some kind of a meta reference to all of the various times Kiryu leaves and rejoins in the main games? That might be giving the writers too much credit. At least the actor for Kazama was good. I mean, he didn't look the least bit like him, but at least the resemblance was closer than the Shimano character. I mean, that might as well have been a different guy. Overall, like many of the characters, probably him most of all, Kazama just felt watered down, like a lame version of his video game self. I mean, this dude was a killer. He was the Tojo clan's hatchet man alongside Shimano. These guys killed every member of the Korean crime syndicate together. He just never came across as particularly badass in the show, except for when he fought not Shimano in the end. What was up with that guy anyway? They had a dude who looked just like Shimano, but explicitly wasn't him. He was like the second in command of the Omi Alliance, and he was randomly fighting Kazama in the streets. I thought that was going to be like a reference to the games or something, but I don't know what that was all about. But let's move on to Yumi, because she had a good amount of screen time too. So I think Yumi was the character who had probably the biggest revamp or amount of changes. She was expanded on a lot more than that of the games, and she even got to live at the end. Now, they did split her character in two, as in the game she had a made-up sister, right, that she was pretending to be for a good portion of the games, and she was basically off-screen the entire time, until the ending. But in the show, her sister's real and has a different name and is actually behind the theft of the 10 bill. I also believe her sister actually is Haruka's mom, and Yumi isn't even, doesn't even have a kid. So she's pretty changed. Like I said, she's sort of been split into two characters. But of the two, Yumi is the one who gets way more screen time. We got to see her become a hostess and how she took part in the little heist that Kiryu and Nishiki pulled in the beginning that wound them up in the current situation they're in. In the show, she's also a lot tougher than she came off in the games, but she did a lot of stuff, like I said, behind the scenes that we never got to see. So I like that we actually got to see a version of what her character was doing, even if the story was changed quite drastically. I actually liked that Yumi got to live in the end because, Kiryu never really got over her death. Yeah, he moved on and was with other women like Sayama and Mayumi, but he ultimately raised Haruka in Yumi's memory. But I guess that's kind of exactly why her surviving doesn't really work, unless they don't want to have Kiryu being an adoptive father to a kid. Because in the games, her death, Nishiki's death, and Kazama's death all are a huge part of the great tragedy that is Kiryu. But I did like seeing a lot of her perspective, though. That was definitely one of the finer parts of this ultimately very rough show. She sort of became Kiryu's investigative partner instead of Date during the course of the show, and the investigation of the heist and her sister and all that good stuff. So again, hugely different role than she had in the games. And her made-up sister, who is now real in the show, gets the sole credit of robbing the 10 bill, as far as I can tell. It really does seem like they plan to have a second season to follow up on a lot of these loose ends. Like, they didn't even kill off Yumi's sister. She survived getting lit up in the back by a submachine gun. But anyway, moving on to fan favorite character Goro Majima, someone who really should have been a bigger part of this show. Now, he does not get a lot of screen time, but I believe he translated to live action the best. This actor, he really captured the vibe of the Mad Dog, and he looked like him as well. From what little I saw of him in this show, I believe that Majima's actor was completely capable of pulling off all the various versions of this character, from his flashbacks with Sejima and Seiko to the Lord of the Night persona, 24-hour Cinderella, the Idol persona, all of the Majima Everywhere encounters. I believe he was totally capable of pulling all of that off, and he got about 15 minutes of screen time in the show. He was completely shafted. And his character underwent some pretty noticeable changes as well, even from just the first game. He's depicted as already being pretty unhinged before he lost his eye and had to work in that Sotenbori nightclub. The reason he loses his eye is shown and changed. His entire backstory is essentially completely different. Outside of him turning into a mad dog and his close brotherhood with Sejima. In the show, him and Sejima are ordered by the Tojo clan leaders to find and kill whoever stole the 10 billion yen, the girl with the blonde wig. And through this, he has his first encounter, or I guess second encounter with Kiryu, because his first encounter that we see was an antagonistic confrontation in one of the Yakuza offices or something like that. They sort of just make him a mean rival-esque character to Kiryu in the very beginning, but again, he doesn't get enough screen time for this relationship to even be kind of fleshed out. It seems like the writers just assumed Majima was just always crazy, or that's just all he is. But personally, I just think that they didn't understand the character. Majima isn't fully crazy, he's just living his life unrestrained by anything, and the Mad Dog persona is his own sensationalized version of himself that he uses to achieve this way of living his life. You know, after everything he survived in Yakuza 0, all the different people he met, he was sort of inspired to become something better, crazier, but it was something that he felt was fully himself. It's part act, part exaggerated version of self. I mean, we see his Yakuza 0 persona, his normal, more subdued depiction, come out sometimes like in Yakuza 3 and 4 and 5, and I think 6. I just barely remember what he did in 6. So he very much isn't fully crazy. He knows when to be serious. But all of this is a lot less impactful if he's already a fucking lunatic when we meet him. His crazy side is just his own personal way of enjoying his freedom to the fullest after having to live under the thumb of the Omi Alliance's Sagawa, the best Yakuza villain, I might add, and his superiors. I think that's ultimately why he leaves the Yakuza after the first game and forms his construction company. The Yakuza was just another cage, like the Cabaret Grand for this character. I mean, he's so much more nuanced than he's depicted in the show. In the show, he's literally an assassin who fails his mission, who recklessly fires his gun in public, gets his eye cut out to Gary Jules' Mad Worlds, a cover of it, gets banished from the Yakuza, which also doesn't happen in the 90s like it does in the show. In the games, he gets briefly banished for his assistance in the Ueno family hit, which is depicted, I think, in Yakuza 4 or 5. Then he's sort of turned into the Sagawa clan's slave and forced to run the Cabaret Grand and become the Lord of the Night. During that time, he's technically not a part of the Yakuza, though, so I guess there was this brief period where he was banished in the 80s. But when he comes back from his banishment, he's finally reinstated in the Yakuza, he re-shows up as the Mad Dog, which does happen in the show. The chairman of the Tojo clan finds himself surrounded and outgunned and outmanned in the final battle of the series. So he's forced to call Majima, and everybody's like, oh, that banished Mad Dog, why would you call him? But they're like, he's the only one who can save us. He has the men, he has the nerve. Which is something I really liked because they do rely on Majima and his family, which is pretty large in number, especially in the second gang. They send Kiryu to pretty much beg Majima to rejoin the Yakuza because they need his men. And sure, in the show, Majima showing up to save the day at the end and just going ham with 2 bats was excellent. And it's a credit to that actor's portrayal because he really did become the Mad Dog, in spite of the numerous writing flaws that could have ruined his character. But really, now that I've seen the entire show, all of the episodes, there really just wasn't enough of him. Even if by some miracle the show was somehow good, it would still suffer from a lack of the Mad Dog of Shimano. And outside of his initial encounter with Kiryu, which also serves as his introduction, where he tries to force Kiryu to light his cigarette, the two only have one other significant interaction with each other, and that would be their fight in the following episode. So it's basically Majima versus Kiryu featuring Nishiki. And this fight really only works because of how good Majima's actor is at actually, selling the character. I actually kind of like this scene the more I think about it, with how crazy Majima is when Nishiki tries to put a gun on him. He just grabs the gun, puts it in his mouth. Again, Majima's already pretty crazy by this point before he lost his eye. So, again, the timeline's changed clearly. It's also interesting how they had Majima outclassing Kiryu in this fight that happened in 95, which I guess, is how I would see things. At that point, Majima had more experience than Kiryu, and Kiryu hadn't done his 10 years yet. The biggest problem I really have was that they changed the reasoning of why he lost his eye. Again, in the games, it was simply he was trying to help his sworn brothers carry out this hit of 18, well, it turned out to be an 18-person hit on the Ueno family, but Majima was snatched up, so Seijima had to go on his own and do it. He ends up getting captured by the Omi Alliance and tortured, resulting in the loss of his eye. Whereas in the show, it happens because he fired in open public at civilians and at cops. So you can kind of see how, in an effort to make him seem crazy and unpredictable, the show actually made him come across as kind of stupid. I also really don't like that it was Dojima that cut his eye out. That was just kind of weak to me. It should have just been some henchman that he really pissed off and antagonized while tied up. It should be something that he brought on himself, and yes, I get that in the show you can make that same argument, but it's just so much better in the game. He refuses to give this low-ranking henchman an inch, and it results in the henchman taking issue with it and cutting out his eye. It's a bit like Jaime Lannister losing his hand in Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire. That's why I loved it so much. Overall, though, this show is worth watching just for this character, but there really isn't enough of him. You can't just say that this adaptation is inspired by Kiwami and then have Majima in like 2 episodes. Just, leave out the Kiwami part and say you're going to adapt the first game. You can tell the writers knew that they had to include him, but they didn't understand him or didn't really want to write him into any of the main plot, so they just kind of threw him in there randomly. I think the only way he would have worked is if he just had the eye patch and was the Mad Dog from the start, like he was supposed to be in 95. I mean, really, if they wanted the Mad Dog, that's all they would have had to do. They didn't need to depict him losing his eye. He lost his eye in the 80s in the game. Nothing is gained from showing it, and it just ruins the mystery of his character by showing it and then watering down all the reasons that it happened. I swear, they suck all of the complication and nuance out of these characters and the things that happen to him with this adaptation. Him losing his eye, both the scene and the reasons it happened, is so much better when it's depicted in the games where it's shown, I believe in 4 and 0, or it might be 5 and 0. But look, I could talk about this guy for another hour if I really wanted to. Let's move on to some of the smaller parts, like Date-san. Now, I've always viewed him in the games as like the cop version of Kiryu, like what he would have been had he chosen to become a cop instead of a Yakuza. I don't want to go too off topic and explain the guy's whole life story, but in the games, Date is shown as a pretty competent, solid, understanding cop and a good friend to Kiryu's. Whereas in the show, he's sort of like this little kind of shady, weasel-looking guy who's way smaller than you'd expect him to be, if you've played the games. He's like, yeah, let's let Kamurocho turn into a bloodbath because fuck the Yakuza, that's why. And that whole sequence of him in the room where all the Yakuza were killing each other at the end was just really stupid. Besides the Mad Dog being needed by the chairman to help them get out of that whole debacle. That I was fine with, that felt very Yakuza. Too little too late though. And again, Date is kind of just replaced by Yumi as Kiryu's investigative partner, so there really wasn't much left for him to do in the adaptation, so it's a wonder why he was even introduced in the first place. There's nothing really wrong with the acting, the dialogue delivery is fine, he just looks way too small and meek and like a completely different character, like a different style of cop completely than what Date is in the games. Let's move on to Sejima, the brick shithouse of Sasai. He is a protagonist in 2 games, and if all of the Yakuza playable characters were members of the Fantastic Four, he would arguably be the Thing. The dude is just built like a refrigerator. Now in the show he is not that big, but he's noticeably the character. The only problem is in the show he's basically just a prop that walks around with Majima for 1 episode, gets shot, and then is gone, disappears. Unless I missed something. I mean, why even have him? Never mind that he's actually supposed to be in prison at this point in the timeline. But that's sort of his whole character though. He's basically always in prison or about to go to prison or escaped from prison. That's like his whole thing. I felt like his characterization was off too, what little there was. He seemed like just another goon henchman of the Tojo clan and not like a stoic sort of Kiryu-esque guy like he is in the games. I don't know, it just felt like a waste of the character. And the special effects when he gets shot are like pretty bad. It's like they just removed a frame of him not being shot and replaced it with one with blood on his shirt. Like, I can't even explain how bad that scene looked. Let's see, who else? Oh yeah, Haruka was completely bastardized. In the game, she's like the early seasons Debbie from Shameless, like very competent, mature for her age, and smart, but in the show, she's like literally like the complete opposite. She's a stereotypical little brat kid character, complaining about everything, does nothing useful, and completely useless, which is something she never was in the game. Like, she never even complained. She was super smart, super caring, took care of that little Shiba dog, and then sort of just releases him at the end, but never mind that. You could almost use her as an example for how missing the mark this adaptation was, because they completely got her character wrong, and they didn't even seem to care. She was just included for the sake of it. She wasn't even the same character. She wasn't even Yumi's daughter. Several characters probably would have benefited from just not existing in this adaptation. At least Shinji and Kashiwagi can count themselves lucky since they pretty much didn't effectively exist at all in this timeline. A bunch of characters get mentioned. I think Owano gets mentioned, Shibusaya, and definitely Sagawa, but Sagawa's been dead for like 7 years or even longer in the 2005 timeline, so these name drops are ultimately meaningless. I think the worst, though, might be the Florist of Sai. Like, this is a character they completely got wrong. He's literally just Bobby Lee in the TV series. And this is him in the games. You know, he's this stern, scary kind of looking, short ex-cop guy who runs the Purgatory, like an underground fucking criminal hangout. The Florist of Sai we saw on the show did not seem like someone who was capable of establishing the Purgatory in all its glory, and they didn't even include the Purgatory in the show, I don't think. Like, none of it was really shown, at least it didn't feel like the one I knew. He's just another example of a character they completely fucked up on. They literally made him a joke character. Who else? Oh yeah, last but not least, we've got Sohei Dojima, the patriarch of the Dojima family, who doesn't really get a lot of screen time in the games. He appears here and there in 0, Kiwami 1, and I believe Kiwami 2. He might appear in the original versions of those games as well. But he's another one. He's completely different. He's super short in the games and just looks like a just sleazy, shady guy. Like, seriously, he's this stumpy dude with a fro. What looks like a fro, at least, or waves. He just looks like a guy you'd expect to backstab you. But in the show, they were just like, let's just make Dojima the exact same guy as the main bad guy in Tokyo Vice. Like, it's literally just a copy of the bad guy from Tokyo Vice. I could probably rant for a while about why that's stupid. I mean, I'm sure that maybe wasn't even their intention, but that's what it looks like. I mean, this guy, he's not the same actor, but he shares quite the resemblance with the actor from Tokyo Vice, and again, they're both the same character. But I think that's everything I wanted to cover in the main section of this video, so again, as always, I hope you guys found it to be at least somewhat informative or entertaining. I mean, most of these are going off of memory from playing the games, so definitely feel free to correct me if I got anything wrong in the comments. But without further ado, let's have the outro and then some final thoughts that will actually be about the subject of the video for once. So the editing on this one might be kind of minimalist, or I'll just use Yakuza game clips because I don't want to have to deal with the copyright problems of just sharing a rant video onto YouTube. And I definitely don't want Amazon to make money off of my video just because I use some footage of the product that they made. So I said at several points like how serious, you know, the show is, and it is, but there is like a good amount of humor. Like when the killer shoots the manga store guy and he blasts back all comically, that felt very Yakuza. It's little moments like that, like at times with the overly convoluted story, the strange dialogue, and occasional humor, it does feel very much like a Yakuza game, but then you're quickly reminded that it's not. A lot of the blood effects look pretty cheap, especially the when Seijima is shot in episode 3, like I mentioned, and jumping back and forth between 95 and 05 so much can occasionally just get confusing, but I guess it's no more so than when the Witcher's first season did it, and that was the best season of that show, although it's not exactly a high bar. I think that trying to balance those two timelines, though, is certainly an ambitious choice, and a lot of shows are trying to do that, but maybe it wasn't the best choice for this one. I think maybe they were better off of doing like a sort of soft adaptation of one where you focus on all the 99 stuff in like maybe the first episode and then continue chronologically from there. And if they would have stayed true to the source material and thrown in a couple of sub-story plots, it could have honestly been a pretty solid adaptation. But instead, the writers had to make things their own instead of just, doing an adaptation of a story while adding some fun sub-stories. No, they've got to add in this subplot with a masked killer. Yumi's sister needs to be a real thing and actually has to be Haruka's mom. It's just dumb, because if they would have done the soft adaptation like like I said, they could have even kept some of the good stuff like Yumi's new characterization and stuff like that, but no, they just piss all the potential away. You know, I was talking about humor a second ago, and heat actions are a huge part of the humor in these games, and they're always so ridiculous and crazy, but like only the most basic ones are shown in the show. And again, I wasn't expecting a lot or even close to that many of them, but I was expecting at least just one over the top one, and we didn't even get that. Yakuza at its heart and soul is just a over-the-top fun fighting game with some of the greatest and most goofy side content in creation. And in no way did this adaptation convey that feel or that message or aesthetic. And again, I don't even think that Yakuza 1 has the best story. I think the stories didn't start getting really good until like maybe 3, 4, and 5. Those ones are pretty decent. And then nowadays, they're getting really great with the Judgment games. So look, when it comes to the changes, I'm not even mad that changes were made. I'm just mad that the changes suck. Like I said, the story from Yakuza 1 was far from perfect, so people are free to try and make it better, but there's just so much stuff that happens in it that would have translated perfectly to TV screen, and instead they just chose to not even adapt it or change it till it's unrecognizable. Ultimately, it just really feels like they wanted to do their own thing with the IP, which I think was a poor move, and the reception is actually for once reflective of that, because you can never tell with how things are received nowadays if something's actually good or not. But I can effectively say that this had a lot of potential, in my humble opinion, but it pissed away almost all of it and ultimately was a pretty bad adaptation. Which sucks because there's been a lot of that going on lately. Like a lot of shows struggle in their second season, and this one couldn't even find footing in their first. And they really seem super certain that they were going to get that second one too. And shit, they still might. If they do, hopefully they course correct like they do the opposite of what The Witcher did and actually start making the seasons better moving forward as opposed to worse with a higher budget like The Witcher did. Like, they could still correct this in a second season by giving it more episodes, more time to characterize and give people backstory and make these characters more compelling that you actually care about them. But I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Again, I'm going off of my memory from watching the show one time and playing the games. Last time I played through all the games was a while ago, but I have a pretty good memory of them and how they went down. At least the stuff that this show was trying to cover. But yeah, the next video will probably be on Melina and Mesmer, or it could be about the Lothric royal family. I'm still not sure which one to be finished with first. But hopefully we're back on our normal, regularly scheduled programming schedule, because I really hate that there's been so many large gaps in my uploads lately, so I'm trying to correct that. But as always, I hope everybody is well, you know. Be safe, and I will see you next time, hopefully very soon. So, see ya.